Hi there, guys. It's Archie and back for the ADHD Care podcast. I hope you're all doing well out there, and thanks for tuning in to this special edition of the podcast. Today, we have a special guest joining us virtually. I have Andrea Elrom, who is an ADHD executive functioning coach based over in New York in the US of A. Andrea's got 19 years experience working with children, young people, and families in the States, offering workshops, individual groups, supporting, as I said, families, individuals that have ADHD. Mainly today, we're discussing all things executive functioning, what that term means, and some of the amazing work that Andrea does in supporting neurodiverse individuals out there. So pleased to bring Andrea onto this platform for an in-depth conversation on all things neurodiversity and executive functioning.
Archie,
Hello,
how are you?
I'm good, thanks. You?
I love that accent. Love it, love it.
Good to finally see you again. It's been a while.
Yes, same here. Yes, all good. Busy, very, very busy. How about
I bet.
you?
Yes. All good. Yes, since we last saw each other last year in November, I've been busy doing this podcast and speaking to amazing people like you.
Oh, yay. Wonderful. Have you gotten some people from the Chad conference?
I have, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I think people are getting bored of me just saying, "Oh, yeah, I met this person at the Chad conference." I think the last like 7 guests that I've had on here, they've all been from the conference. So yeah, it's been really good.
Terrific. And if you need any other recommendations, I've been around for a while, so I'm happy to help you with US experts. My pleasure.
Okay, excellent, perfect. I will hold you to that. is
You're
is is Jodie joining us today at all?
No, no, she was available at the other time slot, but no, not now. So we're gonna have to get her another time.
Never mind. That's all right. That's all right. I thought today we can discuss all things executive functioning, which is your bread and butter, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I was thinking
Yeah.
about it when you said this is what I'd like to focus on. I
Yeah.
was thinking I first wanted to say that I think it's so important for parents and for ADDers to understand how our brain is wired differently. Thinking about the prefrontal cortex and how the executive functions are housed there. Thinking about how they affect all of our thoughts, feelings, behaviors. And when we're seeing that our kids are having challenging behaviors, it's not because they don't want to do well, it's that they can't do well. And that's because the behaviors are representing, I'm having a really hard time with something. And whether that's self-regulation, emotional regulation, or just the fact that I can't do things that my neurotypical peers are doing, I think that's a really important concept to look at as we talk about executive functions. And
Yeah.
how do we as parents come from a place of empathy, understanding if they could do well, they would do well.
Excellent, amazing. Before we delve into it in greater detail, do you mind just introducing yourself? Tell us a bit about yourself, your experience, and how you fit into this neurodiverse world.
Oh, sure. Long story short, um, as I was growing up, I always knew that I was different. I always knew I was a black sheep. I had incredible strengths, but I also had a lot of difficulties. And one of them was the fact that I was dysregulated a lot. My working memory was not as good as some of my peers. And that self-regulation piece, I really should have had supports. I had undiagnosed ADHD, and I didn't understand why my brain was wired so differently. And then when I was 47, 10 years ago, everything started to come together for me. So then I had my kids, my daughter who turned 22 yesterday, she was diagnosed at 7, I think, and I think my son was diagnosed at 5.
So, what got you into coaching?
Coaching. So I was a teacher in Manhattan for many, many years. I never heard of the word executive function, nor did I know anything about ADHD. So I always say if I would have known then what I know now, I would have been a much more effective teacher. And when I started to look for those resources to support my kids, I took a lot of those parenting workshops, and then I'm like, wow, I can bring in my teaching with my empathy and with my understanding of the executive functions and how our brain is wired differently. And I could share this passion with the world. So that's what brought me into coaching. Yeah.
Yeah. We talk a lot about this word executive functioning relating to ADHD particularly. But for anyone listening out there that's not familiar with that name or title, executive function, do you want to break it down for us?
Sure. So I usually use the definition that executive function are a set of mental skills that help people organize, plan, and control their life in order to carry out their daily responsibilities. I also refer to, well, it's located in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is the last part of the brain to develop, and it doesn't develop until 25 to 30 years old. So I'd like for people to think about also, we as ADDers may be 3 to 5 years behind in certain executive function areas. And I give the example of when my daughter turned 16 and she's like, Mom, let's go get my permit, my driving license. And I'm like, wait a minute, you're 16 with several executive function deficits. I am not putting car keys in the hands of an 11-year-old. Not happening. So I think we really have to meet our kids where they're at and to understand where are their strengths in executive functions and where are their greatest deficits. Yeah, and just
Yeah.
remembering that 3 to 5 year rule when we're looking at our children. Maybe they're not doing the same as their neurotypical peers, and that's okay. They may not be there yet.
Okay. And if we were to go deeper in terms of breaking down exactly what are some of these functions, the executive
Sure,
functions, yeah, should we do that?
sure. Easy one.
Okay. Yep.
So I break it up into 6 different parts. The first part would be the task management, which is really about planning, organizing, prioritizing, getting started, time management, procrastination. And this is where I see a lot of my students going from junior high to high school to college, where the demands are getting harder, where these skills, we have to have a firm foundation of these skills. We also talk about action management, and that includes hyperactivity, impulse control, self-regulation. And one of the big gurus in the fields of ADHD, Dr. Russell Barkley, he feels that self-regulation is really the core of ADHD and how it affects all areas of our life. Then I talk about the memory component, which is the working memory. And for those of you out there that don't really know about working memory, it's where we hold our thoughts and we recall and manipulate bits of information. An example of that might be when you're getting an activation code to get into a certain website or app. It's hard for us to hold it in our head without having to say, okay, let me go back. I forgot the last 2 numbers of the activation code. To go further on, we have people, ADHD used to be known as ADHD and ADD. Right now it falls under the umbrella of ADHD with the hyperactivity piece. I know that so many of us suffer from the lack of focus, the lack that we get distracted very easily. We can't filter out things. So that would fall under the focus component of executive functions. It's hard for us to stay on task. It's hard for us to handle transitions. That's all part of the executive function area of attention management. We can then move over to that self-regulation piece where we feel emotions very deeply, intense emotions, great frustration tolerance. We might see some oppositional defiance, reactivity, to name a few, and also shutting down. And then last but not least is that energy piece. It's hard for us to maintain that energy, to stay alert. under that comes processing speed. And that's how fast do we see and hear stimulus? And how fast does it get to our brain? And how fast are we able to digest it and then act accordingly? So there's so many different pieces of executive function. And I would really offer this community to go onto Peg Dawson's website or onto Chad and pull up some of the assessments in order to see where your child or your executive functions as ADDers stand, and what are the areas that we need to support and find strategies.
Yeah, I think hearing you talk there, I'm sure some of our listeners are listening and going like, okay, they understand ADHD from, okay, the three symptoms: inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. And then you obviously, everything you've broken down and discussed, the executive function, it's not really captured by the actual term ADHD. And certainly when we assess for ADHD or screen for the symptoms, chances are the emphasis will be around, can this person sit still, or can they concentrate for this duration? It's not really tapping into those executive functioning to know whether someone might possibly have ADHD. I don't know if you have, go on.
No, I just think it's so much more than just the fidgeting and can't sit still and needs to be, needs that stimulation. It's so much more than that. It's really the working memory piece, foresight, hindsight, the planning, just planning. How am I going to wake up in the morning, go brush my teeth, get dressed in a timely manner, eat my breakfast, get out the door with everything that I need. So many different executive functions comes into just a small piece of your day. So that's where I think we need to differentiate just between the hyperactivity and all the other executive functions.
So when you begin to work with a new client, what are the first steps that you take to assess their needs, and set the goals, especially in terms of organization and time management skills?
Okay, so it's interesting because I think it looks different for different age groups. And I work a lot with college students and with adults, parents who have kids with ADHD. And the first thing I want to know, well, first I would start saying, here are all the executive functions, the ones that I just read off to you. And I would say, let's talk about where are you really strong, because I'm always coming from a strength-based approach. But then I also really want to know where are the areas that they're struggling. And then we prioritize, where do we need to start first? Because when we're remediating these executive functions, we can't start with all of them. We really have to start with one or two behaviors. So that's where I begin, and then I start to give them the tools. For instance, time management. So many of my students are like, got it in my head. I don't have to write down my homework. No, actually you do. And I give them the quote, fail to plan, plan to fail, because it is so important that we have some agenda of what we need to do. How do we break things down into manageable pieces? How do we externalize everything that we're doing? We do need a lot of those reminders and cues and checklists. And again, you met one ADD or you've met one ADD. We all need different things to support those executive functions.
Amazing. And so the age group that you work with, you mentioned a lot about, college students and, high school students. What is your age group?
So for me, I work mostly with 11th, 12th graders here in the US. And then I do a lot of work with parenting. I do a lot of parenting workshops. I do a lot of teacher training workshops, and just one-on-one with parents who are really having a hard time, because it does start from the top down. So many parents will come to me and they're like, fix my child. Well, before we fix your kid, how about we look at what we're doing in the home and how can we change the work that we're doing with our kids?
That leads me to my next question, actually, in terms of what strategy would you recommend to parents trying to support their children with executive functioning or ADHD challenges, particularly, again, touching on the organization, time management, all the kind of like things that you listed in terms of the executive functioning. What would you be kind of recommending for parents?
So for parents, I just want to say that I think it's really important for them to, number one, start with their relationship with their child. If they don't have a trusting and connected relationship, things are going to be much more difficult. So how do we find that connection? How are we communicating with our kids is really important, because we want to, instead of punishing, we want to really find out what is their experience. What are they struggling with? And instead of blaming and shaming them, it's really coming from a place of tolerance and empathy and support. So that communication piece is important. And then also I do a lot of work around collaborative problem solving, which is the model of Ross Green and Stuart Ablon. And that's really talking about looking at the lagging skills, which are the executive functions, and seeing through this collaboration and through this communication and connection, how do they need to strengthen, like, what are they looking at? What are their concerns? What are they struggling with? Not what are we seeing, but what are they going through with their executive functions? And do they know what executive functions are? So that piece, and I know you mentioned organization. Yeah, I think it's important to have a neat room. Would that be my number one most important thing with everything going on in our ADDers' minds? No, not really. Organization can be, how am I organizing an essay? How am I organizing my planner? Do I even have a planner? How am I organizing? What templates am I using to organize my ideas? Graphic organizers. So again, I think it's important to think about what is the number one most important executive function to build on.
I'm just thinking about some of the executive functioning strengths, like task initiation. A lot of some of the young people, even adults actually, I speak to, they struggle with that. Is to
Mhm.
getting motivation to attend to a particular task. It could be academic task, it could be at work, it could be doing chores around the house. To get started on things. Sometimes once they get started, it's much easier to carry on and finish whatever task that they need to complete. But it's the task initiate. What advice would you give to someone that struggles with getting started with things generally?
Love it. There's three parts to that question. Number one, I think it's really important when we as parents say, go clean your room. For an ADD, or that doesn't mean anything. You're not going to get any results. But how do we break down those tasks? First, we have to model and demonstrate and be with them to help them. Then, after we've broken them down and they're successful at one area, we can then go on to the next area. Again, we may need to externalize what that expectation is. Be clear on your expectations. The second part I want for listeners to understand is that ADDers need passion. We need interest. We need things that are new, novel. We also might need a little bit of that hurry up. I use the acronym PINCH, P passion, I interest, and novel, and so forth. And another tool that I love to use is the time timer. I know it can be bought on Amazon. And there's a TED talk that I once did on the time timer and how do we use it to help our kids see that we see time passing. We allow them to feel time, to see this time through using this time timer, which is really just seeing time go down and then, oh no, time is almost up. Using a timer that's visual, almost like an hourglass, really effective, really helpful. And last but not least, I want to say that as it pertains to motivation and getting started, I follow the work of Jessica McCabe. She has a podcast, and that's great, but excuse me, she has two videos out there on YouTube. One is the Jessica McCabe motivation video, which I really find incredible. I highly recommend it for parents to watch because it gives us a better understanding of where our children are having a hard time and how we can support them. And she has another video called The Wall of Awful, and it really explains about what is ADHD and what are the struggles that we have and how to get around them. So those are a few of my tips that I have for now. Excuse me.
Yeah, no worries. Uh, Again, speaking on behalf of parents, sometimes when you have to deal with a young person that wants to be independent, you have this battle of where do you let go, where do you trust them to be able to then organize themselves, manage their time effectively, and all of that, and hold their hand, if you want to call it that. I speak to a lot of parents of teenagers, particularly, and they always ask me that. Okay, so we want to trust my young person to be able to organize themselves, get themselves sorted out for whatever they need to do. Um, but they clearly can see that the young person is struggling. And I'll speak to the young people, then they say, I think, if only my parents can just give me the space, I can do this. And there's this battle of they're trying to be independent, but at the same time, we know that sometimes some of these young people, they do struggle and they still need that extra help more than, typicals by a certain age where you feel by, the 16, 17, to some degree, you as a parent, you might start to pull away at that point. So what would you say for parents? What would you advise? Because this is something that usually comes up.
Okay, so I really, really want to go back to, and I know I'm repeating myself, that piece of connection is so important, because if they don't feel that they can trust you and they don't feel that that you really have their best interest at heart, and that you need to listen. As parents, we need to listen to our kids' concerns. We have to understand what is it that they're struggling with, not is it what that we're seeing. So let's listen. God gave us two ears and one mouth. Let's listen more than we talk, and let's see what their concerns are. Excuse me. I think independence is not always the goal for right now, but we have to see where we can work with them to set reasonable expectations, and again, to work with them. And once we know that they have the skill, we can start backing off and allowing them to do it themselves.
Yeah. You okay?
I'm
Yeah,
so sorry. I'm trying to mute
that's
myself.
what.
That's terrible.
No
That's
worries.
all.
Yeah, yeah. Going back to what you said about self-regulation, again, part of the executive functioning. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that? Because self-regulation means a lot, and I've heard Professor Buckley mentioning it a few times, and I clearly agree that ADHD essentially is all about self-regulation. Let's spend some time discussing that and just maybe deconstructing it in terms of what that is and what that looks like.
So self-regulation is really pausing. I think we are so fast as ADDers to be on to the next thing. I think when we pause and we really give ourselves time to take notice what's going on around us and to think about what's going on inside of us. If we're feeling that we're getting dysregulated, if we're feeling that our heart is pumping fast, or our hands are getting sweaty and we're getting red in the face, that's a signal that something's not going right. But when we pause to think about our thoughts, to think about what are the sensations in our body and what does that mean? And then thinking about what our next steps are, because we're so impulsive and so quick just to jump to the next thing, we have to slow it down. And we really have to have some sort of toolkit or calming kit. What are those tools that we use when we're getting dysregulated? So two parts. How do I know I'm getting dysregulated? And then what am I going to do about it? So practicing the breathing, practicing calming yourself down. Zones of regulation is a model that I very much very much use. And that's really thinking about, when am I in that calm zone? What calming colors do I see? What are the calming thoughts? What are the calming behaviors? And then moving up that scale of what am I feeling and what am I thinking as I'm going up into the hotter colors. And when we get to the really hot red, the boiling feelings, what can I do in those moments? What are the tools? But if we don't think about these things really, really far in advance and start practicing them when the iron's not hot, then we're going to have a hard time regulating when we need to.
Yeah, and I think about that with inhibition as well, because that goes hand in hand where you pause. Pause allows options, allows you to evaluate, allows you to, you know, consider option A, option B sort of thing. But as we know, with ADHD, it's the impulse control. Sometimes that can take over as you say, whereby you must struggle to pause because naturally they react and then think after. So pausing can be quite challenging,
Yes, and
it's a
go
skill.
ahead. Absolutely. And you use the word react. And I think we also have to understand that reacting and responding are two very different things. So how do we teach responding, which is not emotionally driven? And again, these are skills that we need to repeat and practice. It's not a one and done thing.
Um, why do you think, in terms of these executive functions, they're not really spoken for? Like when you ask clients, they don't really. They know some of them, like you said about the motivation and things, but working memory, for example, that's one classic example of executive functioning. Why is that not really spoken about a lot out there when you think about ADHD, and yet it plays a key role when you think about the symptoms themselves and how a client, you know, gets on with their day on a day to day.
So I think people talk a lot about long-term and short-term, but they don't really think about how important the working memory, they're recalling, manipulating the information, holding it in your head and going on to the next bit of information and how do they tie together. I just think it's something that's not um, as out there as the short-term and long-term memory. So how do we get it out? How do we get it out there? And how do we
Yeah.
make our clients understand this is what it is and you're not broken, but we do need to give you strategies.
Yeah, no, I agree. Now we like in the UK, some of us young students are about to sit their exams. So in a couple of months' time, they'll be taking their finals. Uh, Again, thinking about executive functioning support, I'm sure you've come across and supported a lot of young people in college and school, universities going through exam periods. If we can maybe spend a few minutes trying to discuss and how we can support them, particularly with their revision and all of this executive function that we've been talking about. What advice would you give to any young person out there to help them in this period that they're about to go through with exams, revision, and then obviously thinking about career going forward?
Right. The word that first comes to mind is planning. We really need to have a solid plan. We may also need accountability. And what does that look like? Do we need an accountability partner? We have to think about where are we where do we focus most to get our best work done? I certainly know a lot of teenagers like to study in their bed, not a place for studying. Yes, I want you to be comfortable, but we have to think about our environment. We have to think about what do we need? Are we fueled to start studying? Have we broken down the different areas that we need to study and also given ourselves enough time? So we kind of need a master plan, a weekly plan, and also a daily plan. During the testing time, I know often I see students go into fight, flight, freeze. There's a huge overwhelm. So before we get to that point, again, go back to the tools. What do we need? And to also think about our self-care piece during this time. If we're not taking care of ourselves and we're not getting the sleep and and we're not getting the exercise, we're going to fall apart. We need to eat healthy, we need to hydrate, and we need to just be very mindful about the good things that we're giving ourselves.
So if they are faced with, obviously they've got their schedule for the exams when they sit, when they're doing whatever exams that they'll be taking, how will they go about planning in terms of revision? Because usually some of them it might be quite overwhelming looking at the timetable and going like, wow, where do I start? And as we know, a lot of students or even anyone with ADHD, the procrastination can kick in at that point, and they might rely on leaving it to the last minute and just kind of cramming everything and trying to fit everything, and which can obviously can sometimes lead to burnout as well.
Right. So I'm thinking that so many of the students wait till later. I'll do it later. I want them to know that later is not a time. We have to really think about, we have X amount of hours in a week. And I love to use the tool, the time box, because it breaks down our day into half-hour and hour intervals, and to really look how to use our time wisely, when to have those breaks, because I think breaks are super important. And if you're interested in a model of breaking and doing your work that has proven to be successful, it's called the Pomodoro technique, and you can certainly Google that. I know there's also Pomodoro, there's like accountability partners, something called FocusMate, the app. I've recommended several of my clients to use that, because you're actually using body doubling. And that body doubling is when you're sitting with somebody else, holding them accountable. And that, again, has been proven to be very helpful. When we're starting, just getting started can be hard, but I'm just going to encourage students, start somewhere, because when we start and we feel somewhat successful, I know that success builds success. You may also want to start with the low-hanging fruit of what you need to do, or you may want to start with the most difficult thing. Also, I think it's very, very important to take advantage of teacher and professor office hours, extra time. If you have accommodations, which many ADDers do have, file for those accommodations and use them. If you can have an hour and a half opposed to an hour, go for it. That will reduce our overwhelm as well. So there's a lot of different things you can do for planning, but I think you have to be very mindful about it and intentional, and really try to stick to that schedule.
Many individuals with ADHD, they struggle like in social settings, social situations. So how would you assist some of your clients in terms of improving their social skills and understanding things like social cues?
Wow, that's a great answer. And one thing I will say is that exposure response is something that we use with OCD, but I also think it's very effective for social skills. Exposing ourselves to very benign and small social situations. For instance, if it's hard for you to get out of your room, maybe just go to the library as a first step. You do not have to talk to anybody. Then the next time you go back, and maybe you give a smile to somebody, and maybe the next time you go back, you say hello to someone, and you scaffold and you build on the things that are difficult. I also think joining some social skills groups or joining clubs with like-minded people helps for you to start conversations, because you feel that you have what to talk about. There's a book out there by my mentor, who I think is absolutely phenomenal. Her name is Caroline McGuire. She does a lot of work around social skills, and she wrote a book called Why Will No One Play With Me? I think there are some really good techniques in there, one being reading the room, just sitting back, having a cup of coffee and seeing what's going on around you, and then thinking about what is one step I can take in order to move me forward to being socially comfortable.
Yeah, I think social skills is a big one, really, for young people, for adults as well. And, we often hear the word masking. Certainly for young people, sometimes it can be challenging, whereby they might not be fully aware of how they might be coming across, or how the other young people, friends, other young people around them are perceiving them. But obviously, as we know, as they're getting a bit older, that self-awareness sort of kicks in, and you start to find that they, to some degree, start to learn ways of adapting and fitting in without making their traits as apparent in terms of their ADHD. But we know that sometimes that can then affect their, that would then eat into them when they are away from that social situation. You might feel that they're having to work extra hard in that setting just to be accepted, or to feel not as to stand out as much as what they wouldn't have been like if they were to just be themselves. And I don't think some people realize that, it's either neurotypicals, they might not be aware of that. That it's a task that one has to do to prepare themselves before putting themselves in a social situation. And whilst they're in there, they're constantly watching what they're doing, how they are, how they might be perceived, which is why it's quite mentally draining. And sometimes that's why a lot of people would try and avoid situations like that, because of that burnout and them not being themselves. And There's so much you could do to just mask yourself in a situation, and how many times would you keep doing it?
Right. I think that's an excellent question. And I think, first of all, we have to be self-aware. What is really hard for me? And then, and I know it's draining. So again, I'm going to ask, what do we need to do before going into that social situation? Do I need to work out beforehand to get some of that dopamine going? Because the last thing I would ever want anybody to do is to do things that are harmful for themselves before getting into these situations, because that is going to get you into a tremendous amount of problems. I see it every single time I'll speak to a client who is masking in harmful ways. They always end up in a very dangerous and detrimental situation. So I also think I'm going to ask those students also to take the VIA character assessment. It's a free assessment, and to start looking at their character strengths and to see what are the strengths that I can bring into hard situations. So for me, some of the things have been humor. I try to be humorous. I have a love of learning. So I like to ask questions of other people, get curious. And I know that people love to talk about themselves. So that's a really good technique to use. And you don't have to go into full-fledged conversations. Start with a question and then start to scaffold and build on, okay, so they answered that. Let's go to another question. We need to take these steps slowly. And again, building that self-esteem with a lot of wins. Let's keep collecting those wins, and success builds success, like I said.
What's your views around the use of technology to help improve executive functioning or to support executive functioning? Things like use of reminders, timers, diaries, notes, writing things down, all of that. Because I've had mixed feedback. Some people think um, they're useless. I don't use them consistently. Some people are like, I can't even do and function without using my reminder or my timer or my diary. What do you usually advise your clients?
Right. So I think that every ADDer is different. I know I often recommend the time box or the planner pad for writing in. And I think that so many of them are like, nope, I got to do it on electronics. And that's fine. But I think the downfall is when we use electronics to support our executive functions, and then we start using it for TikTok and YouTube and Netflix, that's the downfall. And I've seen it across the board, and it really frightens me because it is just hurting us and not helping us. So I recommend that when you are studying, you do take your electronics and you put it in a lockbox. If you do need an alarm, I suggest buying that time timer. You could take it with you wherever you go. You can get the app if you feel that you can use it without going down the rabbit hole. But if not, get a tool that's going to work without bringing you down. I do think there are a lot of apps out there that are fabulous, but it has to work for you. What works for one ADDer may not work for the other ADDer. So I do love
Yeah.
apps, but I also love writing things down. I'm old school.
I was just about to say, I have some people that still have the old school diary, like the hard copy diary, not electronic, but yeah, they prefer to write things down. And yeah, as you say, carry it around and things compared to having something like electronic, like a online like an e-diary sort of thing. So yeah, I agree. I think it all depends on the on the person, what works for them. Because yeah, there's this talk about, oh yeah, you need to use this, you need to use that. But I think, yeah, I agree. I think it's all about whatever works for you, and you stick with that and you try that. If I was to move the conversation forward to late diagnosis ADHD, do you work with clients around that? Do you see some people coming to you who've just been diagnosed at a later age? And usually, what do they usually come up and say to you that, what are some of the themes that usually come up in terms of late diagnosis?
So interesting. And again, I was diagnosed only 10 years ago. And a lot of parents come to me and they're like, I didn't get a diagnosis until my kid was diagnosed. And then I said, oh, this is who I am. So I think there's a huge aha for them. oh yeah, this is why I failed at this, and this is why people could do that and I couldn't. So I think there's this big awakening for them. And I also think that comes with shame and trauma and failures. But I also think it's really empowering to know I'm not broken. I just need to do things differently. And I think the beauty between therapy and coaching, the difference is that, yes, we can do therapy where we're looking into that trauma, we're looking into the shame. And the coaching, executive function coaching, is more about the here and now. And how do I move forward? Yes, I get that I have these deficits, but how do I move forward? Let's look at some actionable steps. In therapy, I can cry about that stuff and know that I was a victim, but I like to not look at ourselves as victims. I like to look at ourselves as we're ready to roll up our sleeves and we've just begun, kind of. There's a lot of hope and a
Yeah.
lot of resources. Mhm.
And I think it's hard to change patterns and routines, and particularly if you're used and accustomed to doing things in a certain way, let alone the older you get as well, those rituals and patterns and of doing things are quite fixed as well. So do you come across those challenges, and how do you get your clients to shift from that? Because it's a mindset thing, isn't it?
It's so funny you just said that. I just wrote that down. Carol Dweck, mindset.
Yeah.
Carol Dweck invented this growth versus fixed mindset. She has a book called Mindset out there. And I think it's very important to know that we do, with effort, hard work, and a lot of skill building, we can move forward. And there's so much that we can do. Not I can't do, but I can do. So I do recommend perspective changing. I also think about what are the routines and systems and habits that I have had in the past, and which ones do I want to change? And how do I break them down to make slow changes? They say that change happens after like 30 to 40 times or 2 to 3 months. So you need to be patient. And again, you may want to work with somebody, whether it's an accountability partner or an executive function coach, to be able to change these routines and structures. And then what are the new ones that we need to put in place?
Yeah. What is the difference between executive functioning coaching and traditional ADHD coaching? Because there's a lot of coaches out there, and I know you all have different specialities and things. If someone is listening and they want some support from someone like you, who's an executive functioning coach, can you maybe explain and differentiate the two?
So to be honest with you, I think executive function coaching has become really hot these days, but I also think that we have to be careful of who we choose to be our coach. Many people are just out there like, oh, my kid has ADHD. I really understand it. It's almost like when people go to a pediatrician and they say, oh, I'm going to have this pediatrician medicate my child for ADHD. There is so much information involved in this, and we really want to make sure that we're working with somebody who's an expert and has been properly trained. Like I know I went to several years of ADHD coaching school, and I did parent training, and I did mentor coaching and a whole bunch of different things. I think it's really important to look at someone's credentials and to say what stands behind your name and your title.
So yeah, and just to clarify as well, so if I was to go for a coach who just says who has the title ADHD coach, how would I know that they have executive functioning experience? Is for yourself? You've got that title, executive functioning coach. Other coaches they only just have ADHD coach. How
Right.
would we know the difference?
I I think it's just asking. I think it's coming out and saying,
Yeah,
like when you look at going to a surgeon, you don't just say, "Oh, I like that last name." It's what are their credentials and how many years experience have they had? And I think you can shop around. You don't have to just go to, um, you know, shop the market, because there's a lot of
yeah.
good coaches out there. And I will say, two organizations that I highly recommend is CHADD, CHADD, and they can absolutely send you to great coaches. I would look also at ADA, Adult ADHD. They also have some great coaches. I have incredible recommendations. Like I said, I've been around for a while. And Yeah, and for social skills, I would go on to Caroline McGuire's website. She has a lot of great social skills coaches for those who need social skills.
I met Alan Brown at the Chad conference last year. Yeah, he's probably one of your your professional colleagues, friends, and he talks a lot about executive functioning. As you know, he gave a talk last year, which is obviously great. He talks a lot about procrastination and all of these things, and he's got a book out, which I've just been in the process of reading actually. Um, do you kind of like, as coaches, do you usually kind of keep in touch with each other? Do you always sort of meet up, and how do you support each other as coaches?
I love that. I was actually on the phone with a coach just before we got on, and we were talking about women with ADHD. So that's a book that was written by one of the gurus out there for women. Her name is Sari Solden. So we're constantly in touch with one another, these coaches, and we're sharing whether it's a new book or whether it's an article. But I have to say, two resources that I have to recommend. There are so many groups out there, and Bergen County CHADD, CHADD, that's my, I'm on the board there. We have so many incredible resources. We have so many free parenting groups and adult groups for ADDers, and recommendations and coaches that we can source out. So we have expert speakers the first Monday of every month, and we've had some of the really biggest names in the field come. They're for free. Come, listen, share the wealth. And as coaches, we are constantly with each other trying to learn from each other and get coached ourselves and be supervised by each other. So there's a lot of camaraderie out there, and we're just getting more and more knowledge.
Okay, tell us about your parent training workshops that you run.
Wow, my parent workshops. So it's a 7-week, 1.5 hour a week. We start with ADHD and executive functions. What are they? And we go into depth as to what I shared today on the podcast. And then we start talking about how are we going to connect with our children. Are we spending that quality time with them? Are we finding that time, that non-agenda time where there's no fighting and we're really hearing each other and just connecting? How are we collaborating using that that collaborative problem solving model? How are we learning how to really listen? How do we mirror? How do we validate? How do we empathize? And then we talk about setting clear expectations, following through. We talk about incentives versus consequences. So those are some of the sessions that I do in my parenting workshops. And for anybody that's interesting, I will definitely share my information at the end of this podcast for sure.
Yeah, great. Do you are you trained in any of the kind of the parenting programs at all? Like, as you know, there's so many incredible years, Triple P, and are you trained? Are you a parent trainer? As in, like, have you done any of these?
Yeah, so I work for PTS coaching on the side, and I do a lot of work under Cindy Goldrich. I facilitate all her workshops for her. And that's also what I do in my private business as well. So yeah, we do those workshops there. I also do a lot of homework workshops for parents to understand how they can avoid that homework battle, because there are a lot of struggles after school around homework. So we want to avoid them. And Archie, if you're interested in collaborating and doing some workshops together, I would be more than happy to facilitate them. So I don't know
Amazing.
what's going on and the need in London right now, but just know that the offer stands.
Amazing. I'll hold you to that.
Okay.
How important is the parent themselves maybe going forward with being assessed for ADHD, particularly if there were, I'm thinking about a situation where, a young person or their child which has been diagnosed, or children, and you are working with them to try and implement strategies to manage the young person's behavior because of the ADHD. If they were undiagnosed ADHD, how complicated would that be if you are then trying to get them to implement certain things, or address certain issues that they're facing with their own person if they have undiagnosed ADHD?
I think that's a great question because I do see it a lot. And I think that I would like for parents to accept their diagnosis and to understand their struggle. So first understanding which executive functions are they having a hard time with, which of the executive functions are their children having a hard time with, and then how do we remediate the parent skills and also the kid skills. So there's a great understanding about what is ADHD, what are the executive functions, and then remediation.
Another big one as well is coping with stress as a parent. I think typically, whether you have a young person with ADHD or not, stress is a huge thing that a lot of parents go through, and sometimes that can affect your role as a parent as well. Again, going back to what we were saying about looking after yourself, your lifestyle, your sleep, your eating, and all of that. Yeah, what would you advise? What would you be? What's your thoughts on that?
Okay, so I think about when we say when you're flying, God forbid the plane is going down, we put the mask on ourselves first and then on our kids. Again, it starts from the top down. We need to look at our self-care piece and where do we need to fix that? We have to be self-compassion. We need to find that within ourselves. And there's an excellent self-compassionate guru that I follow. Her name is Kristen Neff, and she does some really nice work about self-compassion. And also, I think that we need to learn how to lay down proper boundaries within our family because kids will really take advantage. And that's where the anger and the resentment, I believe, starts. So we have some, I look at the wheel of life, we call it, and what are those areas that we have to start changing? And how do we do that slowly? Remember, the world was not created overnight. We need to break these things down and do it slowly with support.
Yeah. Final thoughts for our listeners, anyone struggling with executive functioning out there or ADHD or know someone who might be in that situation, what would you be advising just as a final word of advice?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to know that there are so many resources and there's so much hope for us. We are not broken. I promise you that. We were born with different levels of dopamine, and there's a lot of things we can do to get that healthy dose of dopamine, whether it's exercise or properly medicated by a doctor and other ways. Again, I would look into support groups, CHADD, ADDA, and I would start to just understanding what is ADHD. And there are so many great books, Ned Hallowell, Russell Barkley, parenting books. The book that Cindy Goldrich wrote about parenting is fantastic for women, Sari Solden. So there's a lot of resources, and I will certainly give my information out if anybody needs more resources. And just get started somewhere. We do have the CHADD International Conference, which will be out in California next year. There's a wealth of knowledge. There's incredible people in the field that you meet and you walk away and you just feel like, wow, I'm not alone.
Yeah. That's what I felt that was my second year coming to that CHADD International Conference last year. So that's where we met. And your talk was fascinating as well that you gave because you're one of the speakers there, and that's how we connected. And I was like, okay, I need to bring this lady on the podcast. And that was beautiful. I think the networking part of it, which is great, connecting with people and finding out how things are done in different parts of the world and stuff like that. So you mentioned that you're part of the CHADD board. So are you kind of one of the organizers of like the conference, for example? Do you contribute to that?
So I definitely did. I am actually on the board of CHADD Bergen County, Bergen, Bergen County, which is New Jersey. But the big board, no thank you, do not want that responsibility. I have I have 3 ADDers. Now I got remarried and I have another ADHD son with ADHD, I should say. So I have 3 ADDers, and having it myself, there's a lot going on here. I don't need any more responsibilities on that end.
Are you one of the speakers on the upcoming conference? Are you going to be talking again this year?
Actually, my proposal is in. I'd like to start doing a talk on teachers and how I can help learning and behavior in the classroom, because that's an area that I'm very passionate about. I think that a lot of our teachers are not educated enough about ADHD and executive functions, and I think we need to start training them. It's super important.
And I agree. And that's another podcast that we can maybe discuss when I bring you back on. And I agree. I think that's something that certainly I see. And in terms of the lack of awareness and knowledge around executive functioning in schools. And I think teachers need to be more mindful and more aware of all of the things that we've discussed today. So maybe we can spend more time focusing on that when I bring you on next time. Was there anything else you want to let our listeners know before we round things off?
Archie, I just think that you're wonderful. Really, I think that you have so much to offer, and I thank you for asking me to be on your show. I do want to say that my email is Elrom, ELROM, Andrea, ANDREA @gmail.com. And I really invite you to email me if you have any questions or if you need any resources. You can also go on my website, which is creADDive, spelled CreADDive, solutions.com. And there's so much hope. Please, no, we're not broken. We're great. We have so many strengths. We just have to focus on our beautiful selves and strengths and just keep moving forward. We have to do the work, roll up your sleeves, get started now. And I know there's just so much promise in our futures.
Well said. Well said. And yeah. Are you on social media at all?
I'm really not, because
Okay.
something as an ADD I struggle with. So for me, it's like word of mouth. And I am happy to give you my email, which I just did. My phone number in America, 201-240-0921. Call me. I'm here for you. And Archie, whatever you need, I'm here for you as well. So I just want to tell you that as an undiagnosed ADHD till I was 47 years old, I was a major alcoholic. I was masking, and I was going to share like a little bit, and then I'm like, that's not where I want to go today. But masking ADHD because I felt like a failure. I felt like I was no good. I just was a hot mess and insecure like you can't even imagine. That's why I'm on my third marriage. Just really feeling like having so much trauma and RSD and all those things. So yeah, I've spoken from my heart before, and I just kind of want you to know that that's really where my coaching came from, because I needed to let people know that there are so many possibilities and opportunities rather than just we're stuck and life is going to suck for us. So I just wanted you to know that.
Amazing. And thanks for sharing that, and certainly for turning your life around as well and doing something positive to try and help others who may or may not have gone through exactly what you went through. But that's the beauty of it, of you were able to turn it around.
Yeah. And if you ever want to add that into what we just said, I'm happy to share that, because you know what? My trauma and my struggles, if people can learn and move forward, then they have some validity in my life, So
I spoke to Cassandra Arson, who was the keynote speaker at the recent conference. I don't know if you went to the keynote. Right. Okay.
Just a tiny bit, and then I had to go do mine. Yeah.
Okay. But she disclosed a lot of things about herself and her journey coming into this ADHD world. And again, she was very open about it in the conference. And when I spoke to her in the podcast, she was very open about when she ended up going down the criminal route and she got arrested and she was in prison. And then she came out and all of that. So I find those stories amazing to me, and certainly for our listeners as well. That resonates with some people, and they can see how someone's coming from that to doing what you're doing, to doing what Cass is doing as well. So if you are okay with that, I can add this in there in the podcast if you want.
Sure. I have no
Yeah.
problem. No
Okay.
problem. Just success stories that I came from
Exactly.
hell and I
Yeah,
went into the beautiful life. Not easy every day, trust me. And I
I
want to
know.
tell you, as a woman who's 57, who has gone through menopause and it has a terrible working memory, and I also have multiple sclerosis, it's like there's a lot to contend with.
No, I can imagine. I can imagine. But yeah, well done you.
Listen, so how can I listen to this? Because I will hide in the corner and listen to it.
um, I'll email you the link. So
So,
it will be on Spotify, on Apple Podcast, and the video will be on YouTube. So you're going to be famous, basically.
what? Spotify, Apple what?
So
Podcast and what?
Spotify, Apple Podcasts, yeah. So if you go on App Store, if you have an Apple device, just search for podcasts in the App Store. The app should come up, or on your Apple, desktop, and on YouTube. Just search. Tell you what, I'll send you all the links.
I'm going to hide. This is too much for me. Please, I'm such a humble person. Okay, my dear. All right, but listen, I really want you to submit a proposal, please,
Really? Why?
because I think you're wonderful. I think you
Oh,
have a
thanks.
beautiful way of being. I know you're very bright. You're also
Thank
coming
you.
from the UK, and I'm sick of hearing the American accent. No, really. So, and anything you need, really call me. Call me.
I will
Okay?
do. I've got your number now. You got my number as well. So yeah, feel free to ring, and we'll definitely stay in touch. And yeah, thanks for coming on. Really, really enjoyed catching up with you. It's been great. And yeah, let's stay in touch, and I'll bring you back on certainly for the next
Anything you
episode.
need. Anything
I
you
will
need.
do.
Take
Thanks.
care.
Thanks, Andrea. Look after yourself.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.